Well, good morning, everyone. I think we had a great session in the morning hearing about the government sector and how digital innovation is happening there. I think it leads very well to the session that we have right now. So essentially, we'll be covering some of the key things that are happening in the financial sector in India and how platforms like Aerospike have been helping organizations across the financial sector overcome some of the real-time challenges that they face. So without further ado, let me talk about 2 or 3 key things that we are seeing in the market today. So the first thing is just to go back in time 2 or 3 years, right? During the COVID time, some of you might have seen this. We had a case where there were a number of data center outages, right? And a lot of these financial organizations, especially the banks, were hit by the regulator because the mobile banking app was not working, the net banking apps weren't working, you weren't able to use your credit cards, your debit cards, no money transfers, nothing. So what happened? The whole ecosystem changed. The regulator started saying, you got to make sure that outages are controlled. If you have an outage, you better report it, and you can also be imposed a severe fine. It changed the game in many ways. And what it led to, all of you know that, right? I mean, customer dissatisfaction is obvious. There is a financial angle to it, and so on and so forth, right? But essentially, that happened because of the architectures that people built. People built architectures which were active-passive. And active-passive by its very nature means that there is a compromise there. There's a compromise. I mean, this is a legacy thing that people have been having for many years. But once you have an active-passive architecture, it means that if the active side goes down, needless to say, there will be some kind of an impact. It could be in terms of the staleness of data, how much time it takes for you to move over to the DR side, and so on and so forth, right? All of you are very familiar with this. This is a severe challenge. It's a challenge about availability, okay? Now, the second thing, and this is again very, very familiar to some of you. We're talking about fraud. As more and more people are getting online, as more people are doing UPI transactions, the key challenge here is how do we identify fraud as it happens? And obviously, this is something that has to happen. Otherwise, there is a financial impact. But the thing is, when you have architectures which are very slow, which don't move very fast, or cannot identify fraud really, really fast, you can have a case where you have money on the table that you might lose. So there is a risk here. There's a risk involved in terms of reputational risk. There's obviously a clear case of you want to minimize your risk exposure, right? Because that has a severe impact to the business that you're operating. And in this case, the example of this is we work with one of the largest payment companies in the world, which has been using our platform Aerospike for the last several years in this particular context. I'll talk about this in a few slides. The first one I forgot to mention, some of the largest banks in India are using Aerospike in the context of transforming their business in the mobile banking space and net banking space to minimize the issues with lack of availability, right? I mean, that's obviously a big challenge that they face. And lastly, and this is probably very, very familiar to a lot of you, right? When you talk about account aggregators, the previous session, they were talking about account aggregators, right? What is an account aggregator after all? It's an ability to have data. I mean, you look at third-party data across all the customers that you're trying to give a loan to potentially, where you need to have information about this particular user. Now, you can get this in real time, then you have a business out there. It has to be real time. It has to be access to a lot of information in real time. So one of the largest telcos in India, they built a platform with Aerospike where they use Aerospike in this particular context. Now, the issue that people face when they have traditional architectures is you have a case where there's very little customization that you can do. There's a financial impact because your systems are siloed. Siloed systems, right? You have a system which is handling let's say your retail banking systems, there are systems which are handling your loans, your mutual funds, and so on. So you don't have a single view of the customer in real time. The key thing is how quickly can you get access to this data? And traditionally, this has been an issue not just in the financial sector, but across industries, if you will. And obviously, it becomes more and more pronounced as you scale your data. As you have more and more users on your platform, it becomes more and more of an issue. So with this as a background, right, we talked about 3 key things: availability, performance, and scale. These are the 3 big issues. I mean, obviously, there are a whole bunch of use cases which we can talk about around that. But these are the key challenges that one can look at when you look at the financial sector in India. Okay, so what's the bottom line? The typical slide that you would have seen is lots of data continues to grow, that's all a given. But the key thing is real-time data is continuing to grow. It's not just data, real-time data. Real-time data meaning what is happening right now. The moments of truth right now, right? It can't be just what happened 10 years back. It has to be what is happening right now. And that is something which is continuing to grow. And more use cases are getting defined in this space. A lot of you in the financial sector would know this, right? I mean, We talked about fraud. We talked about customer 360. We talked about payment systems. I mean, payment systems as well. It's another real-time thing. In fact, India is ahead of the curve. You look at UPI, what we're doing in CBDC, ONDC, and so on, right? We are ahead of the curve globally. And one of the reasons that is the case is because we have real-time platforms that can work. Okay? So anyway, as real-time data are exploding, we have issues with the traditional architectures. And traditional architectures, by its very nature, are not built for real-time. A lot of you know this, right? I mean, it's not just the applications that you have, but the database which powers it, which is sometimes a bottleneck. And this can lead to a lot of issues, right? Because if you don't have a platform that can scale, if you don't have a platform that can be available, then whatever you build at the application layer, if the database is slow, you're toast. It won't work. And that's one of the issues I talked about. When there was a financial issue 2 or 3 years back, when the data center went down, there was loss of availability because the data platforms were not available during that time. So that's a genuine issue. And so managing this becomes very, very critical. Moving on, so when you talk about real-time platform, what is it that you actually require? You need high-speed ingest. How quickly can the data be available for you as it comes in? The platform, the database platform that we're talking about should be highly available. Typically, we're talking about 5 nines of uptime and over. That is the kind of requirement that you have in the real-time world that we're talking about, right? And obviously, this has to happen while the data is consistent. It can't be the case that you have this available, but it's not consistent. Consistency is a key thing, because if the data is not consistent, then you'll have some kind of an implication, typically financial implication, because the data that you have is typically stale or really not relevant to the user at that point of time. And obviously, it has to be scalable. The performance should be sub-millisecond, when you know what I mean. I mean, the response time to getting the data should typically be sub-millisecond. And in India kind of a market, when you talk of the India stack, we're typically talking about millions, hundreds of millions of users potentially, growing up to potentially 1 billion users, right? And that can only happen when the data platforms that you have can scale very, very seamlessly without any impact to performance. So this is the premise with which Aerospike is built. So what is Aerospike after all? Aerospike is built on 4 key tenets. Okay, you would have heard this before. One is unlimited scale. And when people talk of scale, they probably talk about few GB of data going up to a terabyte and so on. For us, for Aerospike, data sizes start at terabyte level. And we have multiple deployments globally which are at petabyte scale. People have deployed petabyte scale deployments on Aerospike because it can scale seamlessly. Now, that is one part. The second part is we do this without compromising on latency. You get sub-millisecond latency even at petabyte scale. Unheard of in the industry. People who have been in the industry for a long time would know this. And it's always on. 5 nines of uptime and over. I talked about a financial institution in the US who's been running Aerospike for the last 8 years. The largest brokerage firm in the world. 8 years they've been running Aerospike. 0 downtime. Literally 0 downtime. One of the largest telcos in India. 6 years they've been running Aerospike. 0 downtime. 25 different applications. We'll talk about some of the names in India who are using Aerospike. Every one of them has been running Aerospike with literally 0 downtime. Most importantly, for all of us in this room, in today's world, the reality is the cost should be lower. And we can do this in Aerospike because we are a flash SSD optimized database. So the only other way you could do this potentially is with an in-memory platform. And when you build solutions with in-memory platforms, you spend money on infrastructure. With Aerospike, you bring down your cost by making sure that you optimize for the infrastructure that you have. So TCO goes down significantly with Aerospike. And that's one of the fundamental tenets of what Aerospike can do. So going back to what I initially mentioned, right, the key 3 use cases in India that I talked about, every one of them has a requirement for scale. I mean, India stack after all. Every one of them has a requirement for real time, which is low latency, typically sub-millisecond, and millions of transactions per second potentially. Every one of them has to be up and running all the time. If you have a UPI transaction today, it has to be running 24/7. And lastly, obviously, needless to say, in India kind of a market, the cost has to be severely low. Okay? So with this as a background, who do you work with? Who are you after all? Aerospike. We work with some of the largest brand names in India. You can look at it, look at the names that we're talking about. They've been running Aerospike for several years on end. And these are not 1 or 2 use cases. These are tens and 20 use cases in each of these customers that I'm talking about here. Some of the largest banks, some of the largest telcos, almost all the key digital natives in India, which have made it big, are using Aerospike for several years on end. And some of these have grown from literally 0 users to hundreds of millions of users over the last 5 to 6 years. So it works. It has been working in the context of all these platforms. In fact, in the gaming platform, some of you would know Dream11 very, very well. We have powered Dream11's IPL platform for the last 3 years. Their most critical marquee use case, the team service, has been running on Aerospike for the last 3 IPL seasons. And the kind of scale that they have there, some of you would know, is really something that in the industry is sort of a benchmark. And obviously in the back end, it does impact all of us from a financial perspective because people might be doing 10 rupee bets and so on, or they're putting money on the line for 10, 20 rupees and so on. So there is an impact from a financial perspective as well. Okay? So I talked about TCO. This, again, the slide is apparent. You can look it up yourself. So some of these customers who are running alternate platforms for a while before they move to Aerospike, what's the impact? In the first case for a company called Criteo, and this is a company in Israel which is running an alternate platform called Couchbase with Memcache. When they move to Aerospike, you can see that 5,000 servers going down to 600 servers of Aerospike. $18.7 million over 3 years of saving. I mean, this is what I'm talking about, right? And look at the numbers out there, 140 million transactions per second to 250 million transactions per second with Aerospike. These are numbers that the customer has published. Signal, an ad tech company in the US, 450 servers of Cassandra going down to 60 servers of Aerospike. And again, 500,000 transactions per second, going up to 8 million transactions per second with an infrastructure which is much, much lower. So TCO goes down drastically. And that's one of the key things you got to remember. All this transformation that I'm talking about with the companies that matter, they've been doing it with Aerospike at a much lower footprint than they would have otherwise done. So in fact, we're very happy to see that one of the things that all the speakers were getting were plants, because we are very much into sustainability. And with Aerospike, the number of the carbon credits that you have goes down significantly with Aerospike because the infrastructure footprint goes down. Okay? So with that, right, where do you fit in the larger scheme of things with scale and performance in 2 dimensions? We are at the top right. Why is that? Because we're SSD optimized. We're optimized as an SSD platform. We have 14 or 15 different patents on how we make it work with SSD drives. So typically what would have otherwise been run in memory can be run on SSD drives. And we've been in existence for 12 years now. So we've built it grounds up for SSD drives, typically NVMe drives, or you can talk of Graviton instances and so on. It is optimized for the infrastructure that you have. And that's the key thing. Okay, and there are several benchmarks. You can look it up on Google, where Aerospike versus any alternate platform that you have, you can look up the benchmark numbers. How does it perform consistently so over a period of time? Regardless of whether you have a hyperscaler platform like DynamoDB, Cosmos DB, or whatever, there are numbers out there on the web that you can look up and see what kind of benefit you would get out of an Aerospike. Okay. Like I mentioned, it is for real. There are numbers out there, Intel AWS numbers that have been published, benchmark numbers, 1 petabyte, 20 nodes of Aerospike, 5 million transactions per second, and every one of them sub-millisecond. These are benchmark numbers. They're obviously running in production for several years, but they are there for you to look up. It's all available on Google. If you just look up Aerospike, you'll see several use cases of customers talking about, in some of them your peers in the financial industry, talking about how they've been benefited from Aerospike. Okay, there are several things of obviously the gotchas of how Aerospike makes it work. But the key thing is what we call as hybrid memory architecture, where data is stored on SSD drives, but the index information pointed to the data is stored in memory. And typically, it's a single hop to where the data exists. So we can bring down latency to a huge extent, but also scale seamlessly to petabyte scale, if you will. And we can talk about this in more detail, right? It's a very nice architecture, which is very simple, but at the same time is highly scalable and provides you with that kind of performance that you would look at. The platform as a whole, we provide, for those of you who are database inclined, we are a key value database. We also provide you support for graph features, so you can do graph lookups on data. But also you can do things like document lookups, right? You may want to look at data which is JSON-like, hierarchical data. We're also building a vector database of Aerospike. We will soon have multi-record transaction support on Aerospike. So a whole bunch of things along with the ecosystem where we exist. You can bring in data, move out data, and so on with the ecosystem story that we have. We have a kind of fully built, fully featured connector ecosystem that we have with Aerospike. And last but not the least, we have a fully functional engineering team, engineering and support team based out of India. And for all the customers that we have in the region, they have been building features and providing support for customers out here. So I look forward to this event today. Thank you so much.